So my name is Matt Kennedy. I am the Director of Climate and Sustainability within ARP. I have responsibility for sustainable development within the Europe region, and we're based in Ireland. I'm joined by a collective here of different skill sets from ARP to talk you through and walk you through the Thrive application process. So together with me is Ailsa Doyle and Eddie Feely, who are experts in environmental impact assessment, and Julia Vallon, who's an expert in sustainable development and architecture and design, especially with expertise in working with local authorities. So we're generally just going to talk through, just as in terms of a recap of what we did this morning. We introduced it to the concept of sustainable development, the concepts of environmental impact, strategic environmental assessment, environmental impact assessment specifically. And I introduced the idea of climate proofing and do no significant harm. We're going to demonstrate those concepts this afternoon a little further. So I think, Rose, you may want to come back in to shed some light on the structure in terms of the rest of the session, but for me, really, it's about working through the examples, how these different components interact together, and then how we can actually take it forward. Rose, do you want to come in and provide an overview of Thrive? Would that make is that good timing now?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. So just as a reminder to everybody, the Strand 2 applications that you'll be doing under Thrive are for the renovation and adaptive reuse of heritage buildings in urban centres. And these will have been identified in an integrated urban strategy. The buildings that you're looking at for your Strand 2 applications should be vacant, derelict, or underutilised. And the identification of these buildings as being the appropriate one for funding under Thrive must have stemmed from citizen and community-led engagement and the Town Centre First framework, and should embrace the values and principles of the new European Bauhaus. These buildings must also be in local authority ownership or have a property transfer or sharing agreement in place with another state body. So that's basically what you're looking at. So we're now into the capital investment. You've chosen your project. You're now looking for the funding for your capital investment. And it's a matter of looking at, well, what's now required under sustainable development, do no significant harm, EIAs, and climate proofing for your Strand 2 application. So next slide, please. Okay. So basically, your sustainable development and do no significant harm. There are 3 declarations that are required to be completed in your Strand 2 applications by the Chief Executive or the Director of Services of your local authority, okay, in regard to sustainable development and do no significant harm. And that is that they declare that the activities you're going to undertake for the redevelopment of your building will promote sustainable development and respect the principles of do no significant harm. And those 6 environmental objectives we have went through this morning, but all that information is available if you go in and look at Articles 9 and 17 of the EU regulations to facilitate sustainable investment. Not only should the declaration basically provide confirmation that you will promote sustainable development and respect the principle of do no significant harm, that you're also required to declare that you will consider and report on any positive interventions you plan to undertake as part of your project that you are going to implement under Strand 2. Okay, and in order to do that, you're going to declare that you have reviewed, and there's a typo here because the Southern, Eastern and Midland Regional Programme do no significant harm assessment, and there's also one for the Northern and Western Regional Programme do no significant harm assessment, both undertaken in July 2022. Okay, that will provide you with all the necessary information that was done in relation to the Thrive scheme in advance of us opening these calls. It also will provide you with examples of all the positive interventions that you could undertake as part of your do no significant harm implementation. And it basically will ask you it will show you how you can mitigate in your project design and your implementation. So what I would say to you at the outset is it's crucial that you have actually reviewed the relevant regional program do no significant harm assessment before you start undertaking your applications for Strand 2 under Thrive. The guidance document for Thrive provides you with a link to those relevant assessments, and they're available also on the Regional Assemblies websites. Next slide, please. So for your Strand 2 applications, all Strand 2 applications will require a do no significant harm assessment. And you must, as part of your assessment, you must be able to demonstrate in your application that you're incorporating sustainability, life cycle thinking, quality of design, respecting the principle of do no significant harm, and outline any positive interventions you are going to undertake in relation to the principles of do no significant harm in both your project design and implementation. So you're telling us and demonstrating your application how you're going to approach this. Okay. In addition to that, a climate proofing assessment is required for all applications under Strand 2 applications, because we believe that in the vast majority of cases, the funding that we're going to provide to you is going to be funding for capital investment in buildings that are going to have a lifespan of over 5 years. Finally, Strand 2 applications must also declare if the proposed activities, the renovation of your heritage building, fall under the scope and therefore require an environmental impact assessment or screening procedure. And if that's the case, then we would be asking that these environmental impact assessments and screening procedures, copies of those are included, or links to those documents are included within your Strand 2 application. Okay. What I would say to you at the outset is we are not expecting each and every local authority to have experts in every single area that we're talking about here today. What we're saying to you is under Strand 2 funding, you can apply for between 2 and 7 million in funding. And part of the eligible expenditure under this scheme is for consultants, and they can be environmental consultants, they can be do no significant harm consultant, climate proofing consultants, that can all help you and assist you in making sure that you're going to comply. And if that's what you intend to do, then by putting into your budget in your application form a sum of money for consultants to assist you with that, then that's another further way of demonstrating your intention to meet these requirements going forward. So I would say just bear that in mind when you're listening today. And as I said, it's not one size fits all. Pick and choose the most relevant aspects that are initiatives and examples that can be incorporated into your specific project, because not every idea or every example is appropriate in all cases. And that's your decision to make as to what's most appropriate, but you need to demonstrate that in your applications. I think that's all from me, Matt. I think I'm handing back to you for the next slide. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
That was very clear. Sorry, thank you, Rose. That was very clear. So we're coming into the point now where we bring together the conversations around EIA, do no significant harm, and climate proofing, and how they interact together in terms of the application. Let me just remind everyone about refocusing on what Rose said, the consideration within Strand 1 and moving to Strand 2. So to the period of time you would have assessed Strand 1 in terms of the development of an urban strategy, or the identification of projects themselves, or the specification, the costing associated with those projects before you start moving into Strand 2 in terms of the hard capital investment. As you consider Strand 1, you are considering do no significant harm principles and how those principles would actually apply and to your project ideas. As then we move into Strand 2, the renovation, the adaptive reuse of the heritage buildings within town centres, you are now beginning to, it's a much more formalised approach in terms of the assessment for do no significant harm, but it's also an assessment in terms of climate proofing as well. And what we're finding also that the findings of these environmental assessments, these environmental impact assessments and appropriate assessments, they will also feed in to your do no significant harm and your climate proofing. So there is more components specifically within Strand 2 to consider the environmental objectives in a much stronger way than just relate to them in terms of your Strand 1 approach, but also the objective from a climate proofing side becomes much stronger in Strand 2 also. So the do no significant harm template to be completed only within the tables if the answer is yes, and then you need to further details around do no significant harm. But the climate neutrality, the climate resilience dimension, and how they intersect together in terms of climate proofing, the identification of the climate risks that will require further analysis, all of these components become enshrined within Strand 2. And a little later on, we're going to talk you through one notional project and a couple of real projects about how these were considered in other initiatives. We touched on the overview of the climate proofing assessment in the earlier session, but just to re-emphasize a couple of points here. Rose did identify that the investments need to have a lifespan of more than 5 years. I think that's really important, and that's very essential in terms of the Strand 2 dimension. What you want to do in terms of the focus of the assessment itself and the climate proofing is to bring together the mitigation dimensions to your project and the adaptation dimensions to your project. You need to consider what's happening right now and what's happening also in the future in terms of climate scenarios and the hazards and how they would impact your potential project. So from a phased approach, and I'll show you an example of the screening to determine the necessity for a more detailed phase 2 assessment. So I did mention this idea this morning around your screening in hazards or out hazards. You're identifying them, whether they're low, medium, or high impact. And then that will determine the phase 2 dimension, which is really about a more detailed assessment if you identify more significant potential impacts or vulnerabilities as conducted within phase 1. In terms of the impact and funding, it's a large component here. Climate proofing is 30%. So really it's about presenting the templates, filling out the information around the climate risk from a vulnerability perspective or from a resilience perspective, and also how you would mitigate that risk in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases and the particular technologies you're going to use. So in terms of understanding whether climate proofing applies to your application, the reality is yes, it is a crucial step for Strand 2 projects. And there are a number of tools and guidance that are being provided through Thrive, through the assemblies in terms of guiding you towards this. In terms of the support itself, we just would just emphasize that you should really refer to the European Commission's technical guidance for an more in-depth understanding about the structural assessment template and the confirmation and documentation of these assessments. These are all prerequisites for you to make a submission and an application under Strand 2 of the Thrive program. So just before I hand you over to my colleague to discuss, Elsa is going to talk through how SEA and EIA impact in terms of the climate proofing. I think this is just a traffic light system approach to understanding the overlaps between what we would suggest are climate proofing processes and the SEA EIA assessment methods. So let me talk through these in a little more detail. So the green ones are mainly included within an SEA or an EIA assessment or report. The amber lights are partially included within the report, and the red ones are not included. So say, for example, when we look at climate resilience, from a screening perspective, it's not included. But from the greenhouse gas emissions quantification, it is included within an EIA. When you look at the monetization under climate resilience or the compatibility, they're not included within the SEA or EIA approach. But then moving into climate neutrality, what is partially included is this sensitivity, exposure, and vulnerability analysis. That's partially included with an SEA, but as you know, in an environmental impact assessment, that is included. The climate risk assessment then is partially included within an EIA, and the assessment of adaptation measures are included and considered within an SEA and EIA. And the monitoring and the follow-up and needs assessment are also included. So there are dimensions that interact and intersect between what we were talking about this morning around climate proofing, mitigation and adaptation, and the considerations and the links that they play to the environmental impact assessment. They are really the green lights here. So you're really talking about the greenhouse gas emissions quantification. You're really talking about the climate sensitivity, exposure, and vulnerability analysis, the assessment of the adaptation measures. So from a Thrive perspective, you are talking about climate proofing in the context of climate neutrality, which is the greenhouse gas emissions quantification. You're also talking about the climate sensitivity analysis in terms of resilience, its exposure, its vulnerability, and an identification of adaptation measures within this area as well. So that's just a way of linking the conversations what we were having around climate proofing and the tables that you're required to complete, especially within Strand 1, and then moving into the link between that and environmental impact assessment. And as we move to the next slide, I think I hand this over to Elsa.
Sorry, Matt, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, Elsa. Sorry, we couldn't hear you before this.
Yeah, sorry, I take off my headset. Great, thanks for that, Matt. So yeah, look, just as illustrated by Matt there in the previous slide, there is aspects of the do no significant harm assessment that can be taken from or supported by those subsequent assessments, EIA appropriate assessment, whether they be screening or full assessments. So the application guidance does provide these two tables, and they're in Appendix 6, I think, to fill out as part of your do no significant harm assessment. So we did go through as a team earlier in the week some of those criteria that you do just have to go through it and tick off yes or no kind of questions and a bit of narrative as part of those forms. And a lot of the information we found can stem, as I said, from that EIA or those AA exercises. And the next slide, I will just show, I guess, how they interact or how some of the questions might be answered. But you can see that, you know, there is one question in particular. Oh, sorry, thanks, Chriselle. So these are some of the questions just summarized. So there's obviously two tables, as Matt said. If you answer yes in table 1 to some questions, you might have to go on to table 2. But a summary of those questions are here. And I've just put in green, I guess, what the kind of key topics are and how you can see how they compare then to the environmental factors that are considered under environmental impact assessment. So, you know, will the project lead to significant greenhouse gas emissions? Will there be adverse impacts on the current climate? What is there going to be impacts on good status of ecological potential of water bodies? What about the use of natural resources or the use of materials? Will there be any emissions to air, water, land? You know, these are things that are evidently, you know, that are also considered as part of EIA. So as part of those, you know, the environmental factors there, whether it be a screening or a full assessment, we should have already, as part of those assessments, go through an awful lot of what we need for our forms. Now, We will go through a notional example later where, it's it'll be clear that not all of the information is going to be contained within the EIA, hence why there's kind of two overlapping assessments, but they absolutely support each other, and one does give way to the other. And then you'll see, I suppose, as number 6 there, the questions from table 1 and table 2, are the activities funded under the scheme, so the project, will it be significantly detrimental to the good condition and resilience of ecosystems, including those of interest to the European Union? So this is ultimately, is there going to be an effect on a Natura 2000 site or species? This is your appropriate assessment. So that, I guess, also just links into the importance of making sure that those assessments are carried out at the right time and adequately, so that you can fill out this, significant harm assessment. As I said, this might come a little bit clearer as we go through kind of a notional example in a couple of slides, but I might hand back over. I think it's to you again, Matt.
This idea of some worked examples using the Thrive template. So let me begin by what we have here is we've taken a hypothetical example, and we're basing it on a case study that's within the guidance note, which is when we were doing the round table and preparing for the slides, we thought it might be useful to take an example of a protected structure. So this is the case that is cited within the guidance note, which talks about the conversion of a former convent protected structure into 12 apartment dwellings and the construction of 56 houses. So it is quite an ambitious project in terms of renovation of a former convent protected structure. And as you can see, I'm not going to go through the details here in terms of the cases, but this is outlined in terms of the establishing if the proposal is sub-threshold development, and then the preliminary example of this in terms of the cases. So when you were going through this type of hypothetical example, what would you do? You would look at phase 1A, which is the climate neutral screening statement, or you would look at phase 1B, which is the climate sensitivity and vulnerability analysis. So let me talk about those two things here on the right hand side. So these are the tables that you will be required to be completed. And in terms of the climate adaptation part, we're looking at themes here firstly. So the on-site assets, the actual structure itself, the building structure itself. And then what you do is you rank low, medium to high the vulnerability to particular climate hazards or variables. So from an Irish perspective, the hazards normally would be like changes in temperature, either up or down. It would be precipitation, the link to flooding, the link to sea level rise, etc. So we don't experience a lot of the other types of hazards that you may, seismic hazards or earthquake hazards in other regions. So we tend to focus on temperature and precipitation as being the core hazard. So for here, the assets themselves highly susceptible to flooding, but low in terms of changes to heat. The inputs itself, as in the water into the project, a medium risk, medium impact in terms of hazards, and then the products that result from it are high or low, a high impact in terms of flooding or a low impact in terms of heat. So what you're doing here is you're doing a qualitative assessment of the impact of particular themes within your project, and the assessment in terms of the high, medium, or low from a sensitivity to the hazards, to flooding, to heat, to drought, etc. And what I mentioned this morning as well, so not only are you doing that assessment, that qualitative assessment based on your current climate, but you're doing it on projections of future climate. Now, if you were doing a formal sensitivity or climate risk assessment, you would be using the scenarios for different temperature degree levels. But for now, you're just really looking at, with the changes, with increased flooding that may come in the next 10 to 30 year period, then that suddenly your flooding risk moves from medium to high. Your heat risk depending on the location of your asset, might move from a low risk to a more medium risk, and your drought risk remains at low. So then what you do is you take you calculate the highest score of the current and the future climate, and then that gives you a high rating. You move then down again into the sensitivity. So just so as a reminder, the sensitivity and what we mean here is you're identifying the hazards from a sensitivity perspective, but you're also looking at how exposed they are, and that really is around the exposure of your location. So from a sensitivity perspective, your asset is high to exposed to flooding, just based on the example I gave earlier was, say, a Docklands project may have high exposure to flooding, and then maybe another example then being the sensitivity might be medium in terms of heat and low in terms of drought. So you're just calculating in quite a qualitative way what your climate risk assessment has said in terms of various what they refer to as themes in terms of the project and how that impacts from a climate hazard perspective. So this is in many ways the way that you would complete this screening statement to identify whether it's low, medium or high impact and the sensitivity of that climate risk within your own project. So we did talk about earlier, we're just giving the example here of the green roof system that brings co-benefits. So this is, there's a tendency within the descriptions to often deal mitigation separately to adaptation, but ultimately what you're trying to do is, under climate proofing, provide co-benefits associated with each of them. So what you ideally want to do is to identify measures that can give you both adaptation and mitigation co-benefits. And we talked about that example earlier this morning for those that were online with us. If I hand you over now to Ailsa, she's going to talk through the do no significant harm in terms of Strand 2 assessment.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So what we've done here as a group, again, we took that notional example that Matt has introduced, the conversion of former convent protected structure into apartments and houses on its curtilage. And we just worked through some of these questions, I suppose, that are in the do no significant harm assessment, excuse me, which is contained in Appendix 6 of the application guidance. So we haven't gone through them all, but I think we've gone through two, and there's one on the next slide that will just give you that feel for how the EIA or supporting assessments can really feed in and really help you fill out these forms and to complete that do no significant harm assessment. So, for example, the first question that you need to ask in Table 1 of your do no significant harm assessment is, are the activities being funded under the scheme expected to lead to significant greenhouse gas emissions during the life cycle? So going back to our notional example, and the OPR guidance that Matt had showed up in that example, they screen that out for EIA, but they do obviously go through that screening process and they do consider it for its potential for significant environmental effects. So that work has already been done, and they have all of that work and the recordings, I suppose, to hand. So what we would then answer as part of this do no significant harm assessment, relying on that EIA screening, is no, the proposed project is not expected to lead to significant greenhouse gas emissions during the life cycle for the following reasons. And a lot of these are specified as part of that form. It's quite small to see there, but it's, the form is yes or no. If no, does it satisfy the following? And that's all those bullet points there. And a lot of them can be answered through your screening. I hope that makes sense. I know but so the proposed project relates to the conversion of a former convent into 12 apartments and 56 houses. The proposed project is therefore not dedicated to extraction, storage, transport and manufacture of fossil fuels or downstream use. And that's one of the criteria in the form. So we've very clearly stated that it's just a different type of development. A climate proofing assessment has been completed that outlines that there are no significant climate risks related to the project. That's where your climate proofing assessment comes in, and the findings will support your do no significant harm assessment. The proposed project will be constructed in accordance with all relevant building standards. The projected life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from the project will be in line with those of any standard housing development and will not undermine the greenhouse gas mitigation objectives under the Paris Agreement or hinder the development of climate mitigation solutions. Works will comply with criteria set out. I won't continue. But again, that was one of the criteria that's set out in that form, and we can respond because we understand the nature and scope due to our other assessments. The work will not adversely affect the level of resilience to physical climate risks of other people, nature, of cultural heritage, of assets, and of other economic activities. That's fair enough, and we've taken that likely from the environmental impact assessment screening, and the works are consistent with local, sectoral, regional, or national adaptation plans and strategies. So you can see there's, you know, not every criteria, I suppose, has been supported by information that's come from the EIA screening or the climate proofing assessment, but a lot of it is. And I might just flick on to the next slide there, Chriselle, just for one other example. Thank you. We've also looked at question 6 there of the Do No Significant Harm assessment. Are the activities funded under the scheme expected to be significantly detrimental to the good conditions and resilience of ecosystems, or to be detrimental to the conservation status of habitats and species, including those of interest to the European Union, i.e. our SACs? So again, using our hypothetical project, we've worked through what our answers would potentially be. So we're saying no, the proposed project's not expected to be significantly detrimental to the good condition and resilience of ecosystems. An ecological assessment has been undertaken to identify whether the disused convent has become a habitat for any protected species. No protected species were identified as part of this assessment. This is one of the criteria, again, that's listed in the appendix, and it's answered through the appropriate assessment that would have been carried out as part of, or screening that would have been carried out as part of that project. An environmental impact assessment screening has been carried out in accordance with Directive 2014, which concluded there would be no likely significant effects on biodiversity. So again, relying on your EIA screening there. Works will comply with the criteria set out in Appendix D of the Southern Regional and Midland Regional Programme Do No Significant Harm Assessment. So that's fine. And then finally, the final criteria has an appropriate assessment been carried out, and we'd say a report for the purpose of appropriate assessment screening has been carried out with respect to the project, which concludes that. And I've just put in a example kind of screening statement summary that would say there's going to be no detrimental or no adverse impacts on a site or species. So there's no further full appropriate assessment required. So yeah, that's just an example of 2 of those kind of do no significant harm assessment criteria that you need to answer 2 questions, and how very much so they can be relied on other assessments that will happen in the background, most importantly the EIA and the AA and the climate proofing.
Well, thanks very much everyone for rejoining. We were testing a couple of concepts at the break there, but I think it's important what we're going to talk through now is 3 live cases. These are real cases that where we're bringing together climate proofing, we're bringing together climate risk assessments, using mitigation and adaptation technologies, but also looking at the revival, restoration, regeneration of historical or heritage buildings. Let me begin by talking about, so I will introduce 2 projects, which is the Limerick 2030 project and also a project within Dublin, within Boland's Quay, both quite famous buildings themselves. And if I can just get the control there. Yeah, perfect. Okay, great. So Limerick 2030 is one of, so this is just for background for everyone, this is a subsidiary of Limerick City and County Local Authority, and it was developed and established to develop the urban renewal of Limerick City. So it took in its ownership a number of different sites, the Opera site, Cleves, the Gardens International, Mungard Park, and Troy Studios. But for the purposes of today, we're going to focus on Garden Internationals, and it'll become clear why. So we've been working closely with Limerick 2030 within the city to aid the rejuvenization of Limerick. And you can see on the site here, it's quite a large footprint in terms of the centre of Limerick, and the multiple of buildings of all different levels of development within inner city Limerick. There were a number of ambitious dimensions to this project. you can see the size, a number of different parcels from apartments and residential to commercial, to the development of a new city library, existing office refurbishments, landmark buildings. So this is a huge scale in terms of inner city rejuvenation. But for the purposes of how we found this was be a really good case study to mention here today, because within one dimension of the Limerick 2030, there's a project called Gardens International Site. So Gardens International Site comprises of 3 historic structures. So the Hanging Gardens, which are 230 or so years old, 220 years old. You have the post office buildings in the general post office area, which are 120 so years old, and then you have the Mercantile, which is thought to be contemporary to the general post office. So really, these are protected structures within the development plan. And within that regard, the Hanging Gardens and the Mercantile building were also considered to be within the curtilage of the protected structure, and so are also deemed protected. And you can see the ambition that Limerick 2030 had. They wanted to develop and rejuvenate quite a large footprint of a site, but there were 3 historic structures that they needed to consider as part of that development. So the work that Arup and the team have been helping Limerick 20 on was divided into 2 different phases, and you can see that in terms of the 2 phases, phase 1 entails the investigation of the company structure with regard to introducing environmental, social, and governance into the values of it. But it's much more important in terms of Thrive to talk about phase 2, which was an environmental assessment of the site to take the format of the EU taxonomy compliance assessment, which, just as a reminder, is do no significant harm. It's the 6 environmental objectives under do no significant harm. But that it also involved a further mature step, which was about the global warming potential and the adaptability to ISO, enhancement of circular economy, conduction of climate risk and vulnerability assessment, again similar to the climate proofing, the link between the neutrality and climate resilience that you have within Thrive. So, and we also conducted a social and governance assessment in terms of the organization to measure its social scoring in terms of governance. So you can see on the graphic below, highlighted in blue and red, is the actual gardens protected structure. And what we wanted to explicitly look at were the do no significant harm criteria. Those are those objectives for mitigation all the way across to biodiversity. And we also included an assessment of the minimum social safeguards also. And when we were considering the climate risk, I just think it's important to understand what we were screening in and out. I talked earlier about that the vast majority of the hazards we experience in Ireland are either to do with temperature or to do with precipitation. But there are a multiple, depending on the location of your site, coming back to what Eddie was talking about in the session this morning, that they could be different types of flooding. They could be if your coastal sea level rise, or the impact that heavy precipitation can have in terms of your project. There could also be storm surges, cold wave fronts or heat wave fronts, changing wind patterns, changing humidity or temperature variability or water stress. So there's a lot of different components in terms of the climate hazards. And then on the right hand side here, you go through further ones, some of which we can screen out, like in effect wildfires or tornadoes, but some which may be screened in depending on the location of your development, which could be soil erosion or landslide, etc., or heat stress in certain instances. So what we did with Limerick 2030 in terms of this historic structure was went through a screening in, screening out procedure based on the climate hazards, and that the follow-on step was to rank them in terms of exposure, sensitivity, and ultimately coming up with the vulnerability assessment of the whole project. If I move to the next case, which is Boland's Quay, which is quite a famous development, a historical development. You can see it on the left-hand side. Traditionally, Boland's flour mills, not very far from where Arp are located within Dublin City. So, again, this was in many ways a heritage development, but it involved new development components to it, but actually consideration of the existing structure. So 5 original stone mill buildings, as well as 3 new 13 to 16 story buildings. So a massive footprint in terms of inner city Dublin, in terms of residential, retail and cultural space that they were looking to develop, and the value, significant value in terms of the overall site. So just moving to the next slide, what that looked like in terms of restoration of the protected building. So building A was a 2-story office building constructed in the late 1800s to be refurbished using timber joist flooring construction. Timber B was 5 mills buildings with 5 to 7 stories, with some having deep timber for planks to support timber beams and new steel frames.
This one here is organic. It's a patio and deck cleaner works.
Then, sorry, there's just an interference there. In terms of building C, 6-story former grain stores to be refurbished. And then building D, 2 semi-detached houses adapted for office use. So this is an atypical, albeit quite large in size, but historic building looking to repurpose into a mixed-use development, and then including a factory basis also. And then this is just a snapshot in terms of the pre-planning site inspection. The interior of the abandoned mill and the abandoned mill building. So again, this is what Thrive is looking at. They're looking at these type of abandoned or derelict buildings and finding a reuse, a repurpose for them. I think there is, before we move into Clonakilty, I think we mightn't show the whole video, Chriselle, but it might give a flavour of the video just in terms of breaking up the slides for everyone also.
Sure, just one sec.
Yeah. So the video will give you also a flavour of the multiple actors that are involved, from architects to designers to engineers.
The redevelopment of the Boland's Quay project centered on a complex set of components. We had to completely overhaul a tight, historic urban site into simple, flexible, buildable, and reliable concepts. There were so many distinct elements that needed individual considerations, and sophisticated engineering techniques enabled the ambitions of this project to be realized. For example, we looked at the constructability and the phase development of this challenge site. We carefully examined the existing buildings and made a decision to demolish a few buildings and significantly refurbish others. We also constructed 3 new towers and a pedestrian bridge.
A key decision made early in the design process was to limit the glazing ratio on the towers and set the solar and thermal performances of the building fabric to future-proof the development and to enable excellent building energy performance without compromising on daylight. A bespoke and tested unitized curtain wall facade system in both capped and structural glaze variations was developed to satisfy the architectural intent, to suit the various facade treatments to the different elevations, to achieve enhanced quality and to allow for a speedy installation. The retained buildings were refurbished to improve their structural condition and to allow the buildings to be repurposed for new uses. This included underpinning, repointing, repairing cracks and replacing damaged render, all whilst retaining as much as possible of the existing building fabric. New structures were also provided to the retained buildings to suit new uses and the different loading requirements, such as new timber floors on refurbished cast iron columns, composite concrete slabs on cellular steel beams and slim deck floors, and new RC concrete frames. New modern mechanical and electrical servicing has been also provided throughout.
With the ever-increasing focus on the climate and biodiversity crisis, we can expect a continuing greater focus on the repurposing of urban sites. Boldon's Quay sets an ambitious benchmark in this regard. What we see today was realized through the skilled collaboration between all of the design team, including architects BKD, the client Savills, the funders NAMA, but also engineers from across the piece, from ARP with a full detailed design scope, engineers within the main contractor, enabling works contractor, specialist subcontractors, the temporary works designers, the assigned certifier, fire engineer, monitoring team, and also Dublin City Council's technical teams. The team truly delivered on the high performance brief with a BER A3 certification for the redeveloped campus.
So thanks very much. Thank you very much, Chriselle. Yeah, maybe we can go back to sharing this slide deck as well. Great. Thanks, Chriselle. While we wouldn't anticipate that the level of ambition would be the same, I think that there are principles within the Boldon's Quay project, such as the repointing, the repairing of cracks, the retaining of render. All of these are critical components with regard to rejuvenation of derelict buildings. And I think the Boldon's, the mill perspective, the factory dimension to it is a very good case study in terms of exhibiting the different disciplines that are required, the importance of having it fully from design all the way to implementation, and in terms of consideration, and the role that the City Council will play, as well as design engineers and architects. So it's really a very good example of repurposing of a historic but yet derelict structure. So they were the two real examples that we could find that we find that are exemplars in terms of the application to thrive. If we move to the next one, and I know Julia is going to join us to talk about I think the Clonakilty case, and maybe I'll hand over the next slides to Julia, and then we'll have some questions after this.
Thank you, Matt. And hi, everybody. Chriselle, I'm taking the control of this, if it's okay. So for who wasn't present in the morning, I've joined ARUP as an architect and urban designer, and after a 20 years experience working for the local authority and doing urban regeneration and a city center, town center of an ACA, a special area of conservation value, and for 20 years in key historic towns. And that's a very big learning for me and for showing you this case study in terms of the points that Thrive is flagging today on a scheme that actually was delivered starting from 2012 for 10 years. So this is this morning we spoke about how sustainable development intertwined with Thrive, and we spoke about sustainable regeneration, reimagine and transform the town center to make it possible that vacant building and dereliction come back to reactivation. And in order to do that, those buildings need to be repurposed. Otherwise, we end up with a town center full of museums. So we need that to reactivate these buildings, and we need to do it in a sustainable way. So it's important to note that this is Clonakilty 400 was a plan developed in 2012, and it was not just to fix a small space which was full of vacancy and and dereliction, but it was actually to have a bigger vision, which is the point where the urban integrated plan comes from, and the urban design in general, which covers a very much a heritage-led plan. So it's about sensitivity, and all of these town centers in many towns, as I said this morning, are all protected, and they have protected structure. So not only there is a sensitivity in terms of the historical ACA, but also it's the curtilage of heritage, which is connected to protected structure. Clonakilty 400 includes 2 squares, a streetscape, and a building which was empty and vacant. So the plan is quite complex in terms of the achievement. But it is important to note, as I said there in the right column, is to reactivate. It was able to reactivate commerce and live above the shop, because, for example, if I start to phase 1, the Asna Square and MS Square. In Asna Square, which was the heart of the town, was all vacant building, and there was all dereliction, and there was not all dereliction, but it was a lot of no life, nobody lived there, and run down, full of parking spaces, etc. So we reactivated the commerce and live above the shop. We retrofitted urban nature with trees and ecosystems. And we also reimaginated the streetscape, which is important. As I said today, is not only the building, it's about the streetscape, it's about the ground plane, and how this needs to be not only sympathetic with the building and the heritage of the building, but also needs to be a catalyst for activation. We want people to come and live in those buildings after we have refurbished and made them sustainable and active. So it's about adaptive reuse in the case of the empty building that I'm going to show you in a few slides, and it's about working together with the community. The important part of this has been done in 10 years. So it's been constructed in 10 years, and that makes us thinking how important is that long-term planning, because if we didn't have this plan, we would have missed a lot of opportunity, and we would have missed this collaboration in local authorities, because having worked in local authority for so many years, I know where the challenge comes, and we are working in different departments, but this is about having a big plan, holistic and transdisciplinary. And I want also to note that the Clonakilty 400 was selected by the new European Bauhaus Commission in 2021 as to demonstrate the 3 pillars of built environment, which is to be sustainable, inclusive and beautiful, which is, of course, one of the criteria of assessment of Thrive. So if I go to the next slide, often I presented Clonakilty 400, but never had the opportunity to actually show how much heritage study and design is in each of the detail of that public space. And this is, again, it's a public space not only to be sympathetic to the buildings, but to attract people to come back to those towns. So you can see a small monument like Takanasta that in the past was a very classic plinth, and it was actually totally reconfigured in a more abstract and not very analytic way to be. As you can see in this image there, you can see how it was completely random solved. So the study started on the heritage, and the study started to see what was before and how can we reflect it in a contemporary way. And you can see the plinth of this monument as well reflect what the original plinth of the monument was before it was demolished. So there is small little things actually that are very important part of the design that address then a beautiful result, as you can see there. Next, please. And moving on to the before and after. So you can see from this slide there's a lot of closed shops, and mainly the ground place that I say, the ground plan, which was not in a way respected. Definitely harm was made to this, and what it was important to do is to reflect that heritage survey and sensitivity, and that's what the result was in terms of collaborating and make sure that that reimagination that Thrive talks about, and avoiding the sprawl and people to come back to live in the town center. This resulted in a successful way because, sorry, can you come back to the next one, please? this was resolved with the people in collaboration, giving cultural, socioeconomic, and inclusive results. As you can see from the photograph, the buildings came up to life. You can see in this image on the top right, this actually building was all vacant. And of course, the public realm was a catalyst to bring that back. And those premises are now vibrant and thriving. Even in the evening, you can be there and having your pizza and you have the blanket like they do in Copenhagen or in Italy without blanket. But anyway, this is to show how important it is to have the plan, because the important part about having a plan is that we didn't have any funding for the streetscape, but we had a plan. So what happened is very often departments of local authority doing drainage or flood relief schemes, they have a lot of work and plan. But when we are in the ACA, when you are in the historical center, the plan can actually address so much out of a drainage scheme. For example, this is the case on Main Street, Clonakilty, where having a plan was as instrumental to address only with the 10% of cost additional to actually deliver a streetscape of very important value in terms of heritage, and to make place for people. All these shop fronts where some of them were run down. And this is the result of when we have an holistic approach, a transdisciplinary, where problem solving is really up to heritage sensitive approach. And this is also to note that is a sustainable development opportunity for the infrastructure, delivering inclusiveness and people that come back to the town. And to finish, this is also part of the phase one of Clonakilty streetscape and urban design plan. The square of Emmet Square is a very important Georgian architecture facade, one of the most unique Georgian architecture in rural Ireland. And this was about reimagining the square, because there was antisocial behavior, there was a lot of rundown, people didn't use the square at all. And it's about having those ingredients of reorganizing through a very important high quality design, and make sure that the pedestrian design line are actually connected, and connecting the town center with the building that was empty. That's important in your selection of buildings. When you have an integrated urban design plan, you can imagine and you can actually select what is the most strategic building to actually bring back to life, and how can the public realm contribute. So is the case of Emmet Square, where this actually allowed us to implement a very high quality result in terms of even contemporary art in Georgian architecture, quality materials, and little secret of placemaking like water feature to bring back those people. If you see my mouse on the left down bottom of this photograph is the number 7 of Emmet Square, which was a building which was vacant for a number of years. And as part of this plan, I was able to recommend to our administrator in the local authority to buy the building. And once we buy the building, this can become part of the full scheme. So what we did is we bought the building, and we made it as a museum for Michael Collins, and it's in the same square. And through this, I want to note the incredible amount of details of architecture and restoration and sustainability that I mentioned before, where, for example, the building, which was actually all subdivided in offices, and it was very run down, vacant for a number of years, was actually restored to the original history of a Georgian house, but also was recladded of a natural slate, which included the workmanship and the craftsmanship of a local contractor who actually used the same method to actually clad. We did a YouTube video, and this video actually is testimonial of how important it is, and how important even for the economy and for the culture to do this type of approach. Of course, a building like a Georgian building is very, it can be challenging for a museum. So what happened is that the next unit to the number 7 came for sale. So we bought this building with the local authority Authority, and we were able to retrofit all the core services of a museum in there. For example, ticket office, for example, the services, etc. So this is an example to a successful example, which was part of that integrated plan, and this was the phase 2 of the master plan, which was 2016. So to just finish, the result, and now I'm actually talking about and referring to the new European Bauhaus and inclusive sustainability and beautiful effect, and all of this is required as long as we refurbish the building, we repurpose it very much strategically, and we invite people to come back and live in the towns, and the magic happens, because you can see how the community gets stronger, especially it's been co-designing, as we said this morning, and I'll leave you with that, and of course any question, I'm available.